fear this. We fear that they have something out that majority of the people don't know about.
Olan tüm halkların hakları gibi haklar. Ne aşağı ne yukarı, ne fazla ne az.
Pent-up feelings that may result from decades of repression and people who've had members of their family killed by that regime.
A lot of killers. You get a lot of killers. Why you think our country's so innocent?
But I won't attack it because someone sicks me on. I don't let anybody use me to fight their battles.
Hello, and welcome back to welcome back to Varn blog, talking about symptomatic redness. You know what's funny is I didn't ever do that hello introduction that I do when we did symptomatic redness. This is a new thing.
Yeah.
So Amogh and I are talking about the history of symptomatic redness, and now we get to the substantive part, I think. For those of you who are not into the micro, niche, weird questions of how we ended up where we're at, you started doing some research on people like Lukacs. I would say, given you're an academic, professionally, around the coming up to. And I think probably right during the end of the zero version of symptomatic redness. Can you talk about how are they related to each other? Why did you get into Lukacs? Because I found it interesting when you told me, because I'm like, I hate Lukacs. That was my first response. Because everyone's always looking for a Paul to Marxist Jesus, and sometimes people put it on Engels, which I think is BS. Sometimes people put it on Lenin, which I think is a little bit fairer, but not really cohesive. I think we agree that modern Marxism as a methodology and as something that could have an orthodox branch or whatever really begins with Lukacs. But how did what we did, starting off with with heterodox economics, end up with you becoming obsessed with
Lukacs,
with Grigory Lukacs?
Yeah, I think the entry point for me really was Hegel, as with most things. I think my own interest in philosophy, and again, sadly, Doug Lain probably has some role to play in this. Was really in questions about what dialectics was, what Hegel's philosophy was, and to do with the kind of background thought that was present philosophically alongside all this left stuff we've been talking about. That Hegel was right, the 20th century was wrong, and basically everyone needs to study dialectics again. And once everyone learns, studies Hegel's work and understands dialectics, some kind of new form of Marxism will come out of that, right? Now, people who hear that will recognize this as an MHI thought, but it was really much broader than the MHI.
Let's talk about, but that's a Marxist humanist initiative.
Yes.
So that's Andrew Kleinman's specific version of Marxist humanism,
Yes.
as opposed to the Peter Huddish version. And that all comes out of a split from News and Letters in the late 90s, I think, or early aughts. It was somewhere around there.
Yes.
So go on. So I'm just filling in for people who don't know the sectarian history.
Of course. But the idea of back to Hegel goes back to Lenin, when he studies the science of logic, in exile. And it gets taken up in various ways by the Frankfurt School, who also think studying Hegel is the key to understanding Marx in complicated ways, who also Trotskyists, the Johnson Forrest tendency, Dunayevskaya, all kinds of, Hegel is a repeated reference point. But when I was coming through, the way this Hegel thought really came in was with Slavoj Žižek. That he was the entry point to a lot of people for an interest in Hegel. Although he is, strange for his own reasons. I really don't want to open the Žižek box. But yes, Slavoj Žižek kind of was this entry point for me into thinking that Hegel was really important for a bunch of both philosophical and political questions. And I, like a lot of other people coming into philosophy, thought that like the time was right for some kind of Hegel renaissance, that like we could study Hegel and then suddenly there would be this like developed Hegelian research position, which would like, you know, overthrow dominant philosophical positions in America and England and various other places. Now, this sounds laughable in retrospect to anyone who knows a little bit about the way academia works, but we genuinely believe this, and there was some thought that like the rise of Bernie would be like the political wing of this larger intellectual movement. I think this started encountering basically the same roadblocks as the attempt to renew Marxism. Similar of like, you know, people aren't really interested. It's a different intellectual era. You know, a bunch of Hegel's writings are based on religious beliefs that a bunch of people don't share nowadays. You know, and so basically that project ran aground. As with Marxism, it became clear that what was interesting was sort of like debunking or critically studying why people chose to refer back to Hegel, rather than doing the actual thing of studying Hegel. It was much more interesting as an anthropological phenomenon than it was as like a substantive theory to commit yourself to. And again, I say this because at some point we also began thinking this about worldview Marxism. The point was less about building a worldview and much more about building a Marxist worldview, and much more about thinking like why people in various contexts feel the need to build a Marxist worldview, right? So there's much more skeptical, critical stance. In any case, moving this whole kind of like failed love affair with Hegel was very productive because it like allowed me to like ask all kinds of questions about, you know, what do we want from these abstract philosophical systems? Why are people interested in dialectics? All these kinds of things, right? And ask, again, in this more kind of like socially grounded way, what people want to get out of these abstract philosophical views. Lukacs is interesting because he really lays out in a systematic way in the famous piece that what is Orthodox Marxism, kind of like, you know, the case for Marxism as more than a set of economic views, more than a set of sociological views, as a kind of full framework of, you know, what a full kind of worldview or world picture of like where society is headed, and how, given that, you can answer basically every interesting question about your life and what you ought to think by referring back to Marx, right? This pattern that you've seen again and again in parties, right? Like Derek was referring to it earlier on when he was talking about like Trotskyists caring about Aristotelian metaphysics. Lukacs really provides like a theoretical justification for that kind of move, right? So it's really from this kind of Lukacian position that communist parties, and I mean, I when I say from, I don't mean that everyone necessarily read Lukacs. I mean it more in a kind of logical sense. Lukacs really kind of instructs the line of communist parties to like take the form of this like big theory of where society is headed, where culture is, where intellectual life is, and everything has to be combined into an understanding of what the party's line is going to be, and the party understands itself as representing the inevitable culmination of all social trends, right? What the party is doing is the solution to what Lukacs calls the riddle of society, which is every single big problem in human life, human practices, from science to art to culture to all these things, right? So it's really this like extraordinarily grand, ambitious view of what Marxism ought to be, right? It's the riddle of history solved in the most literal sense. So that's kind of, you know, and Lukacs is making this claim in a like a very specific historical context. He's intervening in the early 1920s in this debate between the Bernsteinian revisionists and the Luxembourg revolutionists. And he's intervening sometime after that debate. He's not directly participating in the debate. He's kind of saying, he's kind of responding to a crisis of method that happens after that debate, right? Along with people like Korsch and so on. And he's responding to, debates about revolutionary strategy and debates about, Marxism versus other frameworks. And he's trying to say, look, everyone's confused about what Marxism is. Everyone disagrees about what beliefs you have to have in order to be a Marxist. Here is my story about what differentiates Marxists from non-Marxists. It's this idea of like a belief in, what he calls the social totality, which is this whole, structure of human society thing I was referring to. And also a belief in revolution as brought about by this complete social theory, right? So there is this idea that there is, in MHI circles, it's the self-thinking idea, is what they call this, right? Is you create a theory such that in expressing and developing the theory, you are bringing about, with the help of, obviously Lukacs grants that you have to make assumptions about political economy and so on, but the idea is you live in a time where there is a theory that you can develop such that by developing the theory, you are bringing about a certain kind of self-conscious, intellectually guided, complete social revolution, right? And the belief that you are doing this and the understanding of your own activity as being this kind of revolutionary theoretical development is what makes you a Marxist. Right. And this is an extraordinarily strange thing to say, but it becomes incredibly influential. It's like, it's the Marxist as preacher or priest, like calling into being like the rapture or something. That's like the way I find useful to think about it. And it's helpful because this kind of view is extremely influential, and even in people who don't explicitly read Lukacs, or even people who say they disagree with him, the way their people's Marxist positions develop over time end up looking more and more Lukacian. Even in the following way, that you start out with a theory of society, you start out with maybe some predictions about where, about the nature of class conflict, about the way the bourgeois state is going, etc., etc. And the more you try to put them into practice, the more you have to end up having a theory of the contemporary fallen political world that you're intervening in as having this kind of imminent revolutionary subject, right? So you have to pick out some group in sort of the existing fallen social world, which has political currency, and treat it as the beginnings of, a larger political uprising. And you end up basically having this kind of Lukacian position, despite yourself and despite your whatever your initial commitment is, like criticism or whatever, you end up in very strange positions. This is like, anyone who's listened to Varn vlog, I'm sure we'll go through some examples of this kind of tendency, but you end up in this position where, despite starting out as a Marxist, your political practice ends up being tied to, like, go down the list, fascists, anti-systemic right-wing populists, social democratic parties, etc., right? And more and more, you find yourself in a place where, the sort of like Lukacian desire to meld theory and practice has put you in a position where your initial Marxist commitments and what you do day to day end up radically clashing, right? So this is the reason that Lukacs is really important, I think, that like, not because he was right philologically about what Marxism was. He wasn't. He is as a historian and a scholar of Marxism, Lukacs is flat out wrong. that, this is that Marxism was always a theory which aimed at revolution in his specific sense. Marxism was a theory that aimed for society to become rational and self-conscious and theory-guided. None of that, I mean, I'm making this as a categorical statement, but I'm prepared to defend it. None of that is explicitly gestured at in any of Marx's writings in quite the way Lukács wants it to be. Certainly none of that is implicit in Marxist political practice. I mean, Lukács is kind of aware of this, and sometimes he gestures at like saying that, no, I'm kind of outlining the imminent idea. This is a kind of underlying idea of Marxism that like Luxemburg and Lenin are inchoately gesturing at, and I'm here to bring it out. But it's really not best to read Lukács, especially read What is Orthodox Marxism, as a kind of, this philological statement of what Marx thought, or even what historic movements thought. But it's a useful kind of indication of the ways in which Marxism is forced to develop under modern conditions, with a nation state, with like a public sphere and all these things. That Marxism in practice ends up having to understand itself as part of this larger historical narrative, ends up having to like tell some story about how it relates to modernity, ends up having to face thorny questions again and again about like what its relationship to liberalism is, questions that it's never entirely able to settle within itself, and basically all of these kinds of, Lukács's bigger project was to say that, like, basically, I mean, what Lukács ends up saying in What is Orthodox Marxism is that there is an answer to all of these tough questions. There is a good Marxist answer to all of these tough questions. We'll call that answer revolution. That's the political thing that's going to happen when all these problems are resolved. And right. What it means to be a Marxist is to believe that solution event is destiny.
How does Lukács like put this in specific? Like, because you have the what is Orthodox Marxism as a methodology. The methodology initially seems to be, in the first instance, whatever the councils, the Soviets decide, and then later on, whatever the party decides.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
But then, which again is like insanely circular, because it's basically, Marxism is a science because it is a science of revolution. What those tenets are because either the revolutionary workers in their committees or the party as the like mind of the revolutionary workers, depending on what period of Lukács you're dealing with, and how he's responding to the Soviet Union, kind of changes that. But then, like, he basically says, like, we don't have to worry about any substantive predictions or whatever in Marx in that essay. Like,
worrying about substantive predictions is reformist.
Right. And then the more interesting and bigger leap is like, so you have that problem. That problem is huge in and of itself. But then you get to the point where Marxism by its true Marxism is orthodox because it is a science revolution. It's true because it has a revolution. Therefore, there's a unity of theory and practice in the concept of revolution. Now, Lukács is actually very, very vague on what he means by revolution, which is an interesting problem.
Sure. You'll know it when you see it when you're in it, is a kind of
right. And when you pair that with that other insistence that there's no substantive claims to Marxism but a methodology, and that methodology is the class, then what you and I first got into this when I was pointing out that I don't believe in the strong form of Lukács's standpoint theory. And I also don't believe it in Marxist feminism, or later post-structuralist feminism, i.e. Donna Haraway and Sarah Harding. I think the simple form of standpoint theory is correct, and that is like, yes, there are certain standpoints that certain positions in society will give you, and you will have different knowledge sets and different experiential things coming out of that. What people don't realize, though, is that comes from Lukacs's claims here.
Yeah.
And then was expanded to, by Marxist feminists to women, and then by intersectional feminists to everything.
Yes.
Although trying to remove it from its initial Marxist context, actually, explicitly. So in the 70s, it's a Marxist feminist response to post-structuralism, actually. In the 80s, it's part of how you understand standpoints in an intersectional matrix. By the 90s and aughts, you can literally make truth claims based off of what position you are, and solely off of your experience, which is why there's all these weird ticks and academic leftist language about, the experiential references are actually can be traced back to this part of Lukács, which Lukács did not intend.
Yes, Lukács did not intend, and for Lukács, the standpoint claims are not supposed to be fundamental. He does take himself to have arguments for them. That he thinks that the standpoint of the proletariat, which I didn't mention, it's the privileged standpoint which the theorist is supposed to be representing in bringing about revolution, right? He thinks the reason that is all knowing and all seeing is because the productive forces and society develop in a way such that this standpoint could come about. That this is a rational potential that is present, that capitalism helps to bring about, and that will eventually overthrow it. Now, we can say all what we want about that argument, but that isn't standpoint epistemology as we would understand it today, because the standpoint is not ultimate. I mean, in some sense, you work yourself into the standpoint by having the right political economy. It isn't just that the proletariat are all knowing. I mean, although eventually you get there, but it's no. Capital shows us that there are irrationalities in capitalist society, which, when you look at them in the right way, you see that they're distorted versions of this correct view that will eventually come to triumph in revolution, which is the proletarian view, right? But the point is just that Lukács doesn't, argue in the same way that the post-structuralists do, in that it's not just this appeal to lived experience. It's the social theory is supposed to underwrite the validity of the standpoint. It's the reason the proletariat are all seeing is because we have this broader theory of capitalism. Now, he may be wrong. I mean, most people have thought that he's wrong about this, but at least he took himself to have some kind of argument.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely fair. What I think is interesting about all this is, to me, this gets you into a pretty vicious cycle very quickly about the standpoint of capital, the standpoint of the Revolutionary Party,
right?
What you do when revolution goes wrong, because one of the things I've actually argued with people that they don't tend to pick up is part of the souring of the Frankfurt School on actually existing communism is actually based off of the fact they take Lukács seriously, and thus their answer to the problem that Lukács poses is, well, the workers have been so corrupted by capital that they're no longer a valid standpoint. There is no valid standpoint outside of the jouissance of working through the contradictions of negative dialectics.
Exactly.
That's where they go. And people think this is a major deviation from Lukács. And in some ways it is, but it actually accepts the premises posited by Lukács flat out, because it says, okay, if you say the Soviet Union is a manifestation of the workers' will, and we see where the Soviet Union is, we have to go and backfill why the workers are this way. Okay, in interdialectic of enlightenment, actually.
Sure.
And then negative dialectics for Adorno. To backfill that, we have to then say that something has happened from the totality of capitalist dialectics that has ended the workers' ability to be the revolutionary subject for whatever reason after 1920. Their answer is this nebulous fascism that they attribute from the authoritarian personality, and the way that administrative commodification of culture and everything has removed any space outside of the capital MCM circuit.
Yeah.
But they also think, interestingly, and then this is different from Lukacs because of their political economic assumptions from Friedrich Pollock, that the MCM, driver of contradiction has been resolved in the administrative state. And so you also don't have that primary contradiction in capital anymore. Yes. And it took me forever to realize that was their argument because it's opaque as fuck. And that it was directly related to Lukacs because my weird intellectual development is I've always hated Lukacs, but I had a soft spot for Adorno, for early Horkheimer, and for like Raymond Geist and some of the, the post-Habermasian Frankfurt School.
Yes.
But I could never reconcile that with my rejection of Lukacs. And then what this led me to, separately from you, and this is towards the end of SR, is I started picking up with Esri KB, Esri XK, excuse me. Esri XB.
Sean KB.
Yeah, it's Sean KB and Esri XB. With Esri, my longtime comrade, to apply Lakatosh's critique of Lukacs back to Marxism, because Lakatosh is also, interestingly, both a Popperian and a Hegelian, and he actually thought that Marxism as a science was defensible if a new research program was to come out of Marx, which is what I decided to try to do, was to dig into the history of the Marxist textual reception and to the political history of the First and Second International, and try to derive both a research program and then a political program, which is something I've been working on separately, for what Marxism would be. And the problem that I came back to is that after Lukacs, words don't mean anything.
Yes.
I mean, they really, like, things get like in any, and you can see this in commentaries on my show, on anything that I define, even when I define it in a Marxist way, textually backed up, and then try to find a historical application for it, I will still have people who will play games about, like, well, but this is the working class in itself, but not for itself, and the working class for itself doesn't even have to have the working class in itself in it, which is insane.
Right.
And that, and the other. So you start getting language games to mean that, like, Marx, it doesn't mean what X says. Or you get, like, Althusserian structuralism, where you take, like, early 19th century linguistics and 20th century linguistics and argue of that methodology of science, and then how, come up with a science with some little bit of physics thrown in and a lot of Maoism. And you try to argue from there, but by that point, you've literally made words like ideology, the way it's referred to in Althusserian structuralism, means something completely different than the way Marx means it. Like, and they have to go back and reread that into Marx.
Yeah, I mean, this begs the question, like, why did Lukacs catch on in the first place? Like, what was the motivation for this project? Because
it's interesting, because he's the only key figure who's both important to, quote, Western Marxism and to Soviet Orthodox Marxism.
Although disavowed, important.
He's absolutely disavowed, but he's crucial. Like Stalin's reading of Hegel is in some ways still rooted in Lukacs, which I know people don't like when I point that out, but it's absolutely the case. Like,
doesn't mean Lukacs is a Stalinist, obviously, but yeah.
No, I mean, he kind of was, actually. But,
well, I mean, Stalinist in the,
No, like, he's not a methodological Stalinist. He was, or an ideological Stalinist. He was a Soviet defensist even during the Stalin period, which also complicates his relationship to the Frankfurt School.
Absolutely.
But so he's interesting because both when we go back to people who are neo-Kauskians, or Trotskyists, or even Maoist, or even certain kinds of left comms, all depend on Lukacian theories about class consciousness, history, and, like, why they would cite Lenin and Plekhanov and Kautsky over Marx over and over and over again.
Yes.
It's partially dependent on this justification from Lukacs.
I mean, the answer to the why Lukacs question is that, you know, Lukacs is in some sense the first real true believer. You know, he is someone who really takes at face value what is initially, by the way, SPD propaganda, that like, oh, you just read Marx, you know, and everything's in there. Like this,
even though the SPD, the SPD propaganda, like they don't even have most of Marx's corpus available, even in German at this time.
Exactly.
And what they really push is Kautsky.
Right. So it's much more, and this is much more of a meme than anything anyone actually said. And so Lukacs kind of takes this on, and Lukacs studies with Max Weber, you know, and like is interested in all these other cultural trends, and you know, he's an aesthetic and literary theorist and all this kind of stuff. And so he's like, well, if Marxism is supposed to be this complete science, then you know, it needs to be radically restated from this kind of like rigid, you know, materialist, evolutionist thing that you get in Anti-Düring. You know, History and Class Consciousness, the whole book, and specifically that essay, the Orthodox Marxism essay, is really like Engels and the Engels of Anti-Düring as like the explicitly stated target of that essay, right? And he wants to say that no, the core of Marxism isn't this particular predictive economic theory of development. It's this much broader thing about the overall trajectory of human culture and society towards rationality, towards like self-understanding, you know, the governance of society by reason, all these kinds of grand Enlightenment motifs. You know, Marxism is the culmination of those kinds of tendencies, and it's the understanding that those tendencies are the ultimate destiny of human society. And this broader view allows him to say that there is a distinctively Marxist answer to any particular relevant social question, whether it happens in philosophy, whether it happens in science, happens in culture, right? Because, you know, Marxism is the realization of where everything in society will ultimately go. And so Marxists have to say something about everything, you know. And crucially, all the individual things they'll say about all these things have to line up together. You know, the Marxist biology has to, I mean, obviously, I was about to say biology is contentious in Marxist humanist circles. Like, yeah, Lukacs did not, I mean, I don't want to connect Lukacs to Lysenkoism, but it's definitely true that like one place that Lukacs' thought goes is that if you want to be a good Marxist, you have to have developed Marxist views on every topic. You have to have, there has to be a Marxist biology or a Marxist friendly biology. There has to be a Marxist friendly physics, all this kind of stuff, right? Lukacs, people, this is the weird thing about that, by the way, is because Lukacs' readers are often Marxist humanists or anti-science. But like the funny thing about people like Althusser, who you think of as like the anti-Lukacs, right, is that like in many ways, Althusser's interest in developing the complete science and in connecting, like finding out what the real Marxist method is and connecting Marxism to all of these other disciplines and connecting Marxism to literary theory and developing Marxist theories of all these areas, it's very in tune with Lukacs' aspiration. It's the same kind of impulse, right? It's like Marxism has to be reformulated from the specific form it has, specific economic and political forms it has taken into a broader worldview. That's the idea that both Althusser and Lukacs are going from. They just have different views about how to do that. And again, the reason you can't disavow these projects is because, you know, people who claim not to be doing that, as they try to do politics, as they try to come in dialogue with more and more people, they end up having to take stances on these broader questions anyway. And so they end up engaging with these worldview questions anyway. So this is a kind of inevitable progression for a political movement that has the kinds of grand ambitions that Marxism does. This was bound to happen. Something like Lukacs was bound to come along. Sorry, Derek, you're muted, I think.
Okay, so you've often said that that you think Lukacs is the beginning of Marxism as not a research program or a political project, but as a set philosophy. Although there's hints of it in Kautsky, there's hints of it in Plekhanov, there's hints of it even in the kind of weird relationship in Anti-During, where Engels is both like, this is not a life philosophy, but here is how we can apply it to everything. And actually, you actually point out that part of Lukacs's project is against Anti-During. Why? And ironically, because what Lukacs ends up doing is what he accuses Anti-During of doing.
Yes.
So why is that? So like, what's contentious there?
So to take the first question, why is Lukacs against Anti-During? So basically, Lukacs is very skeptical of any account of Marxism which wants to resolve Marxism into a set of predictive claims. Lukacs wants to say, Marxism is not a theory. And by theory, he means many things, but the most important for now is that a series of predictions about how the economy will evolve, right? And why is he saying this? He's saying this because he wants to respond to the Bernsteinian critique, the revisionist critique of Marx, but primarily of the kind of Erfurt program position, where he wants to say, Bernstein sets himself against one of these economistic positions, that society will necessarily evolve in a way in which revolution will happen. Bernstein says, no, look at, the rise of managerial capitalism, look at all this other stuff, look at workers' consciousness, etc., right? And that's like the revisionist position, which begins from an understanding that Marxism has failed to live up to, quote, the facts, right? And that phrase occurs again and again and again in what is orthodox Marxism, this facts, this idea of the facts. It's like, for Lukacs, that's like an indicator of revisionism. If you talk about the facts and how Marxism needs to be true to the facts, you're a revisionist. So Lukacs' response is interesting
because part of what he's aiming against Bernstein is Bernstein talking about how, like, the Marxist prediction of the proletariat being the industrial proletariat being seen by the SPD as the proletariat, which is a complicated assertion, but one that they believed. Would be the majority of society, so they would either by insurrectionary or by democratic force, just by the sheer size, would automatically win. Bernstein says, like, look, we're not breaking above 40% of the population, and they never do. Actually, he's actually right about that. So
that's a high watermark, and the SPD get back to that point only by diluting their base, by taking in more middle class people. Yeah.
Right. And so that becomes a major problem for them. But I suppose what I am interested in this is why is it natural, do you think, for Lukacs to go, well, any concern about empiricism then is revisionist,
right?
Because is it literally he doesn't have an answer?
Oh, well, right, because you point out it's a strange response, right? He's not doing the Luxemburg thing, or he's not doing the Grossman thing of like criticizing Bernstein's data or criticizing Bernstein's like predictive.
Yeah, both Luxemburg and Grossman do that. Yeah.
He's not doing that. He's saying no. Not only the interesting question is not whether Bernstein is right or wrong. The interesting question is, should we even be arguing about predictions anyway?
Right.
Which is interesting,
which is a weird tact, honestly.
Exactly. Because the thing to note is that Lukacs is often thought of as like, oh, it's a revolutionary Marxist, but that is not the tack that the people on the revolutionary side of the debate took. People like Luxemburg, right? They were perfectly happy to engage Bernstein on his own grounds, right? And they were perfectly happy to have arguments about crisis theory. Lukacs is like, no, I'm going to exit this debate completely. We shouldn't even be talking about this. Why does he do this? I mean, I think the Lukacs is kind of, I think he's taking in these kinds of philosophical concerns, right? He's reading people like Kant and Hegel. He's taking in these kinds of philosophical concerns about like the overall direction of modernity and the destiny of the Enlightenment. I think this is the kind of stuff that he has in mind, that he really wants Marxism to take a stand on the question of like, is modernity good? Is modernity bad? And Marxism should be like defined by its relationship to that kind of big question, right? Go back to the title of your blog, the disloyal opposition to modernity, right? This is what the Frankfurt School called themselves.
Well, they call themselves a loyal opposition, but yes.
Oh, the loyal opposition. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's right. Sorry, the loyal opposition. You know,
Gersten Thurborn in his book Marxism and Post-Marxism pointed that out, and that's where I got it from. And then I actually was called the loyal opposition to modernity, and then I got really pissed off around 2012 at the inability of Marxists to separate from the Democrats, surprise, surprise, even before the DSA, and called myself the disloyal opposition to modernity. So like that's where that came from.
Right. And it's what Lukacs is thinking, I think, is that like he really thinks that there are these much deeper like century-long social trends represented by this word we use, modernity, that are really represent what Marxism is about, right? The long direction of the development of the productive forces, the long kind of accumulation of like, you know, the public sphere that emerges across continents, the rise of like bureaucracies, all of these like bigger trends that we refer to with this notion of modernity, right? That's really where Marxism stands or falls, right? That it has the underlying clue to where all of these big trends are going. So the question of prediction, I mean, I suppose this is also a social theory claim, but the question of like, how do individual people predict how like particular the question of the prediction of like particular social trajectories is thought to be like, that's like narrowing the scope. Like, who cares, Lukacs would say, about, from a Marxist point of view, about how like, sorry, to put it another way, Marxism doesn't stand or fall depending on how things in a particular society go in 50 years or whatever. There are these like much larger, long-running trends which Marxism is a response to. And so in some sense, it's not something like, it's a kind of overall narrative of human destiny. And of course it can be, I mean, I think if you read Lukacs charitably, it can be accepted or rejected, but because it's so broad and because it's so teleological, your reasons for accepting or rejecting it can't just be the facts, right? As with Christianity, right? Like Christianity makes prediction. I mean, let's talk about it as an abstract, it is just as a universal for now. Christianity makes predictions, specifically one prediction about how things will happen in the future. And Christians have developed theories of history. But your overall relationship to Christianity will likely not be determined by like any particular like nitty-gritty predictive theory that the Christians come up with, right? Because it's this like much larger teleological commitment about like, quote, where it's all going. Now, I think I've tried to say that is still sociologically grounded. It's grounded in a bunch of trends that originated in Europe, maybe in the 17th century, which people refer to as modernity, which are not economic. They're partly ideological, partly cultural. You know, we can talk about them, but nonetheless, Lukacs, so in that sense, there is some empirical backing, right? But it's like much larger scale and very macro. But Lukacs also is staking his view on a particular understanding of the meaning of these trends, that he thinks these trends will eventually lead somewhere and kind of ought to lead somewhere in this teleological way, right? And I guess in some sense, a part of the reason I'm thinking about it this way, I now realize that like Lukacs has all these concerns in his mind anyway, and he's coming from like a very, very different kind of intellectual sphere. Like he's reading people like Kant and Hegel and all these people, and he's reading stuff about like the destiny of the West. He's reading Weber on the rise of the rise and fall of religions, all these kinds of issues, and he kind of just sees Marxism. He alights on Marxism as a way to take a position on these larger issues. So it's a kind of I think the way I would think about it is that it's a kind of happy coincidence for him that, look, this politics I like also can be melded into a solution to all of these grander destiny of the West problems that I also care about. These questions are in the air anyway, right? There's a Spengler's Decline of the West, which was written in the early 20s. Like right wingers are particularly interested in these questions about modernity. The legacy of the Enlightenment is Nietzsche is being disseminated more and more, right? So all this stuff is in the air anyway. But Lukács turns out to be the first kind of entrepreneur person who's like, Marxism not only has something distinctive to say about these questions, but because of its supremacy as an economic theory, has the inklings of, a complete answer to all of these questions.
Which isn't suspicious at all.
No, but it's not suspicious, but it's extremely, it's extremely powerful. This is why that's why I like to call Lukács an entrepreneur, right? He really saw an opportunity to combine these very, very seductive, in a very seductive way, these different sets of questions in a way that has proven extremely attractive to people ever since, right? Because all of these questions that like haunt people in Europe and America about the relationship between religion and science, about the relationship between like the rising bureaucracies and the nation state and popular democracy, all of these like larger questions, Marxism turns out to be the answer to all of them. Isn't that fun?
Right. We have the answer already, right? Like
exactly.
Yeah.
We have the answer already, and if you understand these questions correctly, you will know that Marxism was always the answer.
And that answer is revolution, and we're not going to find what that means.
No, revolution is a name for what happens when these questions get resolved in a satisfying way.
Right. And by satisfying, we mean already agrees with what we think is going to happen.
Yeah, exactly. Well, this is Lukács wouldn't put that last thing in, but the point is, in order to apply this, you'd have to, right? It's like,
right.
This is the point. Like, this is why, like, people can always do special pleading on behalf of Lukács. They can say, oh, no, Lukács didn't mean that this specific movement was blah, 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 right? But then you're just like, well, that just makes Lukács useless, right? So,
right. It means that like Lukács doesn't like it. Like if the thin reading of Lukács is useless, and the thick reading of Lukács is, I don't know, dishonest. It almost is another. It's like one of the first like philosophical Mott and Baileys on the left. It's like
exactly. I mean, and now, by the way, thinking about Lukács' move, in some way, we were exploring Lukács' territory, this Marxism and modernity business. That was like a nice summary of a bunch of SR questions, right? It's like stuff about anthropology, stuff about like forms of human relationships which don't look class-like, the relationship between Marxism and religion, the relationship between like the class struggle in the nation state, right? Like all of these Keynesian MMT questions, a lot of them hinge on like, what do you think the precise relationship is between state bureaucracies and the development of the class struggle, right? Like that's a lot of that. Keynesians point out that there's like Keynesians can be read as saying there's like a relative autonomy. What the state does isn't completely determined by pre-existing class struggle, but then obviously it's not. It doesn't float completely free of that, right? And a lot of these debates with the MMTers and the Keynesians are if you're reading them in this productive way, can be read as like you trying to work out exactly where the lines go, like what do, and the law is a great example. Lukács is very, very interested in the law, partly because he's reading Weber, right? And like post-Keynesians, like one huge source of resistance to Marxism has been like people thinking like you can't give a materialist theory of the law.
Right. And or you have these 19th century anarchist hang-ons about the class nature of the law, which, you know, is one of the few things about anarchists I will actually like defend. But it's I definitely see the why that comes up so much, and I think Lukacs is one of the first people when thinking about the class nature of the state starts to equivocate. Like, so that is an interesting question. Like, why does he equivocate? What's that about? Like,
I mean, and one of the reasons, and this is something you've constantly brought up, is that like the state is this place where like you know, a lot of basically people resolve questions about like ultimate political authority. So it's like, or like people's politics really comes into view what the ultimate meaning of their politics is, depending on their understanding of the state. So Lassalle, who you're very, very interested in and you've talked about many times, right? It's like, you know, basically ends up having like proto-fascist views about state authority, right? And like, you know, it's the Hitler being praised by the Keynesians, which is a bit of a cheap shot, but like
yeah, but it's a cheap shot I enjoy. It's one that Jehu used to bring up all the time to basically accuse all Keynesians of being fascists for rejecting the idea of gold money. Which is patently absurd, but this is a useful point where it's like, look,
in modern society, I'm using modernity as a kind of vague term here. In modern societies, when you try to universalize your politics outside, you know, like when you try to develop your political struggle, like eventually you need to have some answer to the question of state authority. And like for a lot of people, a revolutionary answer to that question just isn't possible. And like that shows up in the fact that they end up having these kinds of fascist views that like, look, we can't imagine anything outside of the state. And so in order for communist society to be brought about or social democratic society to be brought about, we're going to assume that the state can do everything.
Mm-hmm.
Right? This just happens again and again and again. You know, you can see it in Paul Cockshott, you can see it in the MMTers, like people from all across the political spectrum. There's some thought that like, you know, the kind of social transformation worth the name that we want to accomplish can only happen. We can only coherently think it.
And unfortunately, it's not just the state, it's specifically at the level of the nation state. And that's the only place we can talk about it.
Oh, God. Yes, exactly. Which brings in ethno-state and racist questions.
Right.
So it's like, you know, one way of seeing Lukacs' point here is that, like, there are these things, I don't want to say outside the class struggle, but, like, you know, we'll stick with that, and we'll stick with that. There are these things outside the class, outside like the in itself economic class struggle that Marxists have to come to grips with, which end up being hard for them, right? The state, the law, religious forms, forms of nationhood, and so on and so forth, which end up like the way Marxists end up having to deal with them is to take stands on these like broader questions about, quote, where the culture is going, which end up getting them entangled in questions that are very far from what their initial concerns, right? So it's like, just broadly speaking, this allegiance between Marxism and secularism, which we've thought a lot about, right? Which is like, you know, this is a massive problem, partly because secularism as a notion is unclear. This is some point you've made many times, and if Marxism, you know, the reason you make the alliance is because Marxism has got to have something to say about religion, right? If it's going to be politically effective. And okay, if Marxism just is secularism, then what does that mean? Does that mean there's like a conditional alliance with liberals in various cases? Does that mean we have to paint all of our enemies as crypto-religious, right? And people have taken various positions on this, right? I know Marxists who say, well, anything that is not Marxism is religious because it implicitly invests, you know, authority in something that, you know, some kind of weird extended definition of religion under which like everybody from Stalinists to liberals is religion.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, this led to like my joke that I used to do where I would like take all the Christian sects that I knew about and take all the weird Marxist political tendencies and like line them up. Like Bordigism is like ultramontanist Catholic, you know, like and stuff like that.
Yeah, you know this history better than I do about, like, I'm sure there have been like Marxist sects which stand or fall where the basic issue is their attitude to the Catholic Protestant civil wars.
Yeah, I mean there probably is. I mean, like, I know one of the big debates actually is whether or not you buy the Protestant origins of capitalism and bourgeois revolution versus the Brundle subsect of the Catholic Church origins. And this actually plays out in like whether or not you think the classical explanation of capital, the Brennerite explanation, or the like Banerjee explanation of the origins of capital actually have an effect. And it's weird because in Banerjee there's nothing religious to it, but in like why some people are arguing about, well, do you put the beginning of capitalism with Savonarola and the Catholic nation states, or do you put it in England? Partly has to do with your theory on bourgeois revolutions and nations, and then partly has to do with your theory on if capitalism is indigenous to late Catholicism, or is it a materialist development of Protestantism? And you can't rely on Marx for that, although Marx does think the first bourgeois revolution is the attempt to, is what we would call the English Civil War. So.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So and the English Civil War is deeply religious, even though, you know, and it's yeah, you end up, you know, Marxism ends up being in conversation with, you know, this complicated bourgeoisie, secularism, liberalism nexus, you know, which is like, because part of the reason you have to engage in these conversations, and I mean, I keep repeating this because I know people's impulse is going to be that like, oh, who cares about all this shit? There's a basic set of propositions which stand good, you know, which don't involve us having to, you know, say anything ambitious. It's like the reason you end up having to care about this shit is because as a matter of political fact, people in human history over the last 100 years have cared about these things. You know, and when political developments are caused or formed by some idea, any practical politics has to have a reaction to that, you know. And you can wish it away by saying, well, eventually the class will develop in such a way that like the questions I don't have an answer to will no longer matter. But like that's just basically saying like in 100 years I can do politics, not now.
Right, which by from my definition of anything important is a cop-out, right? It's just like not particularly useful as a way to handle politics. So why do you think it's still important for us to deal with this, you know, with this relation to Lukacs? Because what did the Bernie scenario and the failure of the SR project and the inability, like, how does this all connect to your studies of Lukacs?
So, you know, I think it's useful to see a bunch of the SR project, I think I've said already that like we were trying to do, I mean, I wouldn't say we were trying to do Lukacs better, but we were definitely trying to cover the same territory, the same kinds of questions that led to his project in a different way. We were trying to say, look, there is maybe a more kind of empirical scientific way of thinking about a bunch of these, you know, quote, hard cases for Marxism, you know, not kinship relations, questions of identity, religion, and so on. There's maybe a way of thinking about these questions that like preserves the spirit, so the scientific spirit of Marxism, and doesn't like throw the baby out with the bathwater in the way that Lukacs did. You know, so I think we would have said in SR more like Lukacs is right to think that like Marx didn't, there isn't like a pre-given answer, an economistic answer to all of these other questions. But if we try hard, we can maybe come up with an answer that's like, you know, okay, and still broadly speaking empirical. Yeah, I think part of what we realized is that the real nub of Lukacs' criticism isn't so much that like you can't come up with a predictive theory of all of this. Maybe you can, but that there is a practical imperative to take the best theory you have at the moment and try to make a complete, consistent politics out of it. And that's where the Lukacs project becomes urgent and interesting. Is that people seem to want to unite what theory they do have with the existing forms of praxis that are available to them, and tell a story in which all of those hang together neatly and nicely. This is a thing that people keep wanting to do, even if, and wanting is tricky here because people don't, the individual people may not necessarily express that desire, but there is a continued social tendency for the unity of theory and practice to be a kind of like imminent desire on the left, and this is the point with SR that I feel like in trying to engage with that, the more we try to engage with that, the more we got sidetracked from the original theoretical questions. The more we got pulled off into these projects, which ended up being colored by this like desire to have the program now, right? Or have the revolutionary subject now. And obviously, people had different views about what that was, but the kind of like theoretical aspiration to like do Lukacs better was ultimately buried by the fact that Lukacs' project was never entirely theoretical and his insight was never entirely theoretical. That there were these practical questions that are going to like doom and make irrelevant any attempt to resuscitate like a purely empirical Marxist research program.
And so why was that crushing to your politics to realize?
It was, I guess, it's crushing because it shows, in a sense, the incompatibility of theory and practice, right? It shows that we live in an age where theory and practice go in two different directions. That, be more precise about what that means, because Lukacs, these are like technical terms. Lukacs really thinks that there is a kind of thinking hard and carefully, which, if done rightly, will also give you political results. Right? He thinks.
Right. So he's, in some ways, I always accuse him of being the origins of Marxist Gnosticism. That the idea that praxis would proceed from theory automatically if you got the theory right, but then there's no substantive theory to get right, which is where things get really complicated really quickly.
Yes. And finding that, for me, I mean, this wasn't just a problem for me. I mean, if this is true, this is a problem for all Marxists. But the way I realized it was that in practice, in this historical period, not in some imagined Lukacian heavenly story, coming up with a consistent theory, consistent theory or helpful theory, predictive theory, actively takes you away from political intervention. Like, just to give you an example, who are the people who are like the smartest and most careful predictive theorists? They're people who like do systems theory stuff. They're people like Peter Turchin, people who do like stuff about elite conflict, resource scarcity. These are the people who end up having the most to say about where society as a whole is going. But they have no politics at all, or if they do, it's not really linked to the social theory.
You're often reading tea leaves to figure out the relationship. Yeah,
exactly. And even in Marxism, by the way, there are like the three biggest academic Marxist research programs. All have different relationships between theory and practice, and all are different. So there's this scholastic library bound, valueful Marxist program, which is like, let's keep reading volume 1 and figuring out which passages of Hegel it lines up with. Which is that those people have no, I mean, I'm sure they have specific politics. You don't get anything out of that. Then there are like the Brennerites, who basically, I'm using that expansively to talk about, people interested in questions of transition, people interested in questions of, class conflict in early capitalism. Very successful, very interesting research program in academic history, right? Has questions about its relationship to like Marxist theory, not clear. Often there seems to be they don't really try to join the dots with dialectics. They don't try to join the dots with, political development. Often a lot of them are social democrats, or Trots or what have you.
Or Trotskyists who became social democrats, etc. Yeah.
Exactly. Nothing to do with the value from people. And then there's the third group, which are like cultural critics, people like Jameson, and what their politics is, who knows? Robert Hillard Kento, the Adorno guy, apparently supported Buttigieg in the 2020 primary. That's a bit of a smear, but I think it rings true to the broader trend of like Judith Butler writing in for Kamala Harris and all this kind of stuff. So it's like it's not even just these like elite theory people. The smartest intellectual Marxists, their politics either have nothing to do with their theory, and even when they have good politics, it's sometimes because they've diluted their theory, So just in practice, seeing that there wasn't any natural link between being a good theoretical Marxist and having like workable politics was kind of devastating to me as someone kind of committed to theory. That was kind of because if you're a theorist, that if you're particularly a theorist Marxist, that's a kind of tragic conclusion. It's a kind of God is dead kind of conclusion.
And so where does that leave you now?
I think I need to think more about the specific. I think part of the reason these debates get so hard for me to work through is because Lukacs built in extremely specific definitions of theory and praxis. So when Lukacs says praxis, he doesn't just mean political action. He means stages of the revolution. He means like the practical bringing about of the revolution, which again, remember, is defined in terms of like, the dawn of a rational society. And when he says theory, he doesn't just mean like any framework used to understand the world. He means like, the coming to consciousness of the subject-object of history. Right. That's what he means when he says theory. So when he says the unity of theory and praxis, he's actually like, that's supposed to be a kind of tautology, right? It's supposed to be like, the intellectual coming into being of the subject-object, the intellectual consciousness of the subject-object of history, and the practical development of the subject-object of history through the working class coming to overthrow capitalism, all coming together in like the victory of a class which knows what it is and knows what society is and runs society on that basis, right? So it's all this like massive circle of definitions, right? So part of the reason that's like a cheery, optimistic thought is that we can take apart those notions of theory and practice, right? We can say, well, maybe we can't have the unity of theory and praxis in Lukacs' specific sense, but there are all kinds of other questions we can ask about how theory in the sense of thinking, in the broader sense, can relate to political action. Questions which get obscured when you take like Lukacs' interests to be the main ones on the table. Like rather than, I mean, the Frankfurt School also, like Adorno is kind of also like this. That like Adorno basically thinks that either Lukacs or the abyss. This is like the assumption he operates with, right? Like if any kind of revolution is possible, it's going to look the way that Lukacs thought it did. That's not going to happen, and so revolution is impossible. That's how Adorno reasons, right? But I think we can have a wider sense of what the options are. And so far I've just built conceptual space for that. I don't really have any story yet. And like there are very powerful reasons why Lukacs' specific concepts seem appealing, but I think more needs to be said before like we're trapped in the Grand Hotel abyss. Before we can agree with Adorno that if revolution was possible, it would have been
the Lukacian revolution as understood by Lukacs in like the teens, right? Like,
exactly. And I don't think we know that yet. Because Lukacs' social theory is while I think it's really compelling and interesting, it's also very eclectic. It's built on all kinds of different things from outside Marxism, right? There's Weber. It's built on, it's probably built on some kind of proto-Christianity, if not directly, then indirectly. Just going off your thing about Gnosticism, and we haven't worked out exactly how those pieces fit together. So while Lukacs is right about something, and while Lukacian revolution continues to be a kind of like magnet for leftist political movements, I still think we're a ways off from seeing that as the only option.
All right. Well, I guess that explains where we're at. That kind of gives the first episode here gives us a narrative history. This gives us a problem of Lukacs and why we both found our responses to Lukacs to be important. You doubled down. I kind of read class theory and history and then decided that I hated Lukacs and stopped there.
But I think we've ended up at the same place.
Yeah, I think we have. I think the other Bretnar that I told you is like if you look at the building of the theoretical Marxism, it comes to Lukacs. If you look at the building of the problems of the Second International, it's the debates between Luxemburg, Kautsky, Bernstein, Lenin, Pannekoek, and some of the other early figures from like 1890 to 1925, ending with Hilferding and the third periodism and post-Lenin problems. And so that's historically what I've become more interested in, because also it looks like now in a lot of ways, and it's the kinds of crises you have. And it's very different from the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, where you had this kind of post-Lukacian, ideologically and politically driven Marxism that actually didn't have a lot to say about economics at all. You look at the kinds of Maoism and kinds of Trotskyism that were emerging in the 60s and 70s, all the questions that they were divided upon were geopolitical or definitional or axiomatic. In some cases, it's even hard to articulate, like, how is this form of deformed worker state different from this form of bureaucratic collectivism, different from this form of state capital, different from this left communist form of state capital, different from this left communist form of bureaucratic worker state. And while those questions are not unimportant now, they seem far more removed than actual questions that were being asked in 1910.
Right. One interesting thing about the Lukacs thing is Lukacs' doomism, Adorno's doomism now turns out, because I remember I used to associate Adorno with Christ, with the profit rate down. I used to think, there's some connection between a kind of Grossmanite final crisis theory. And
but actually the thing is with Adorno, it's the opposite. Is Adorno thinks that there is no final crisis. There's nothing to compel anything. Exactly.
So in a way that's interesting, because it's the doomism is not based on political economy at all.
No, it's based off of this Lukacian crisis of what the consciousness of the worker is, which also this Lukacian framework is why In the 50s, 60s, and 70s, you have this attempt to find a new revolutionary subject or to inculcate a new revolutionary subject, or even in the case of Marxist humanists, to find the quote advanced part of the proletariat as separate from the proletariat as a whole, which is why you had like, you know, obsessions with like black workers and specific as the vanguard or whatever, even though it's framed differently than the new revolutionary subject of post-Lukacian 60s like radicalism.
Yeah.
It's actually the same problem, just in a Marxist humanist framework. Like,
and Maoism with the peasantry.
Right.
Yeah. And who is core and who is periphery. Yeah.
Right. And why is it always nation states that are core and periphery, not areas, and this, that, and the other? Like, yeah, you have these problems emerge, whereas now, in some ways, the crisis has gotten so acute that it almost feels like we've rolled back from those problems, with the exception of a few people who think dung is the answer. And we're now like recapitulating the basically the Hilferding-Kautsky-Bernstein debates, but in a way that hides that that's what we're doing. Like the debates between kinds of Maoists, or the debates between kinds of people who are attached to geopolitics, or even the fact that, as I say over and over again, I can't predict someone's politics just because they say they're a Marxist-Leninist at all on any question. Like,
yeah, I mean,
and that's true for Trots too, but I no longer can at all. Even if they're like not like, I'm like, okay, so are you pro or anti NEP? Are you
the Marxist-Leninist Bidenist thing is a bit of a joke, but not a complete joke. There.
Do you maintain that the DSA was right to maintain a popular front all out of CPUSA for the past 70 years or not? Where do you think the role of the United States is on decoupling foreign policy? How are you going to redefine revolutionary defeatism to mean something completely different than the Zimmerwald left lid, etc.? These are all questions that are because we're actually back at fundamental questions. And it seems like we've now rolled back the clock to the debates of the Second International, although we're in a completely different political context. I mean, and by political context, I also mean like the state is much stronger, literally. Like, the centralization of capital is far more acute. The degradation of the environment is far more acute, etc. So, like, we're back there in some sense. In another sense, like, the stakes are completely different and seem both lower and higher simultaneously. Lower because outside of China, Cuba, maybe part of the DPRK, and some social democratic states in Europe, Marxism is both everywhere, but the furthest it's ever been from power. And like you look at India, like both the Naxalites and the Indian Communist Party, like they might have provincial power. The Naxalites don't, but the Indian Communist Party does. But the Indian Communist Party seems just like a normal social democratic party in the places where it does have provincial power, and at the national stage it has no power whatsoever. Like the Modi's coalition has totally shut them out. Yeah. And you see this across the board, like the Marxist in the Philippines. Everybody told me to be on them. The Maoist in Nepal that were supposedly gonna change everything. And that just hasn't happened. It most assuredly didn't happen in Syriza and Greece, but it hasn't happened anywhere.
Yeah.
Like outside of places that have a pre-1990s instantiated Marxist-Leninist inspired government. And so the other great question
even that may be Marxist in name only.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a lot of cases we have seen in almost all these cases, with the exception of the DPR, actually even with the DPRK, there's been economic liberalization in the last 10 years.
Yeah,
it's just the DPRK's economic liberalization is only with Russia and China because no one else will do business with them because of the U.S. embargo. But Cuba's big thing where there was the revolts. Well, interestingly, while a lot of people were trying to say the revolts were CIA co-ops, they were not. What they actually had to do was an attempt of the Cuban government to liberalize their currency policy in a way that would have really fucked the internal currency and would have led to a crisis. But they were being prompted to do so, not by the West and the embargo, but by trying to deal with liberalizing in a way that economically integrated them further in with China and other parts of South America. Like, that can't be misunderstood now, because what we have is this rhetorical rebirth of Marxism in the Lukacian sense of an ideology, but it has no relation to power or revolution, which is actually itself, ironically, a refutation of Lukács.
Yes, exactly.
Like, it is a refutation of the Lukacian notion of Marxism.
Yeah.
That has been, to me, refuted because by its own conditions, it has not happened under the things in which Lukács developed, either in Western Marxism, in Euro-communism, or in traditional, like, Marxist-Leninist, in the developing world or whatever. That didn't happen.
Yes.
So
that didn't happen. Yeah, no, I think that's right. It's whether that's a refutation of Marxism full stop. It
depends on whether or not you agree with Lukács, which I don't. But that was, the thing is, I'm no longer sure there is a thing, for all my reputation as one of the weirdo, heterodox Marxist defenders of orthodox Marxism, which is what I'm often accused of being, right? As a non-standard Marx-ish Marxist who's still interested in defending Marxism, often against people who have deviated far more from what was from the historical or textual positions, but claim some kind of adjectival relationship, and that's because we're Marxist Leninists, we're Orthodox Marxists, and because we're Leninist Trotskyists, we're Orthodox Marxists, because we're Neo-Celts, we're Orthodox Marxists, etc. We're Bordagists, we're Orthodox Marxists, we're Councilists, we're Orthodox Marxists, we're Grossman-Matic hybrids, we're Orthodox Marxists. And I'm just, because I will say, Lukács is not the only person who does this. Like, if you read Pannekoek talks about how, social sciences are the proletarian sciences, and, Marx is, the bourgeois sciences were the physical sciences, and we needed the bourgeois sciences for the social science. And actually that framework, even though it's different from Lukács fundamentally, still recapitulates some of the issues.
Yes,
Marxism emerges and is a prompting of a new science. It doesn't work the way old science does because of frankly an argument by genetic fallacy that old science is totally bourgeois.
Yeah, exactly.
And these are things that you don't hear people argue anymore. Even on the far, in the left communist side of things, and yet it was the argument in the beginning of the 20th century.
It was the argument, yeah. I mean,
Lukács wasn't the only one trying to do this, is I guess my point.
No, sure, you're absolutely right about the science stuff. I mean, the thing that Lukács might have the last laugh about is that Lukács might be wrong, but some variant of Lukácian Marxism might be the only Marxism.
Right, because there is no, I mean, and this is maybe a Michael Heinrich point, there is no coherent overall Marxism outside of this thing that isn't substituting something else for something not in Marx.
Yes, exactly.
Because even with Kautsky development and all this, you have further developments of the thought that predict. One of the things is, from Kautsky to Bukharin to Lenin, the amount of state involvement in the development of capital is noted. And that's not something Marx talks about very much. Marx doesn't answer the fundamental political questions. I mean, even when you think someone like Monty Johnstone and the Marx-Engels conception of a party, you actually have to go, well, you're really deriving that from letters, and you're really deriving that from Engels' stance towards the end of his life. It's actually not in Marx at all, and it's not deducible from Marx's stances during the First International either.
Yeah. I mean, party, when people use words, people say things like, oh, well, that's the solution, the party form. The party form is the name for a solution. It is not a solution.
Right. Right, exactly. What do you mean by the party form really matters? And as I did go over in my new series on Pop the Left back 2-3 years ago, that word means different things in different contexts, and actually very little of it actually looks like what the SPD meant by it in the 19th century, including the SPD now. Like, it doesn't reflect, actually after Hilferding is actually sits in government as finance minister, and you have the SPD coalition government during the Weimar Republic, you really don't have the party's already changed what it means.
Right. And part of the issue is that the party question is hooked right up with the proletariat question, because the party just is the political it's like the political vehicle of the proletariat's interests.
But what does that mean? And exactly. So
and then we get back to in itself,
like there's these distinctions between a labor party, which is like the party that represents the proletariat in itself, and a socialist party, which is the party that represents the proletariat for itself, and this, that, and the other. That's why there's all these weird distinctions about, like, well, this is a labor party, which is a bourgeois labor party, but it has to be the grounding for the socialist party to merge with, because there has to be a political representation of the working class in itself already for itself to happen. And then that's where the vanguard thesis comes from. And then people think the vanguard party thing just means party of people which are right, which is a weird way to think about it, right? But that's the way they mean.
Which is very
not really what. Yeah, it is. It's the Lukacs framework. That's actually not what the Second International Kautsky's framework was for it. Is like the Vanguard Party is a party of people who are thinking out the problems pointed out by Marx, who have the leisure time to do it, and thus can merge with an actual proletarian movement and together form a party. That's not what ended up happening in the SPD circumstance either, but that was the theory of the Vanguard Party that the SPD operated off of, that became the basis for Leninism in all of its various forms, right? All these questions are interesting because they're not fucking in Marx at all. Like, they're not really there. Like, even like trying to reconcile the Marxist stance towards party when he kept his people out of the All-German Labor League, because it wasn't part of the International, but the International wasn't a party, like, by any, like, it's, these things are hard to reconcile. It is hard for people to grok that, like, the International was not a party movement.
Yeah.
It was a coalition of internationally aligned labor unions acting in a congressional form to figure out how to do political strategy, but it was not a singular party. It wasn't even all socialists. I mean, that's another thing about them. Like, and we're not just talking about the anarchist socialist split between Bakunin, and there's also the Proudhonist tendencies in there. There's the debates around what the nature of the dictatorship of the proletariat between Marx and the Blanquist. There is the fact that Marx actually continually sides with the proto-social democrats in Britain in the First International, which would become the basis of the Labor Party, as well as like the Chartalists. I mean, the Charterists, not the Chartalists. That's a different group. The Charterists and all that.
Yeah.
Movement. It's incredibly complicated, but it actually doesn't reflect any of the debates of the Second International or the beginnings of the parties. Like, exactly. That's later. And that's not in Marx. Which, again, isn't to say that there's no Marxist answer to this, but I would say there is no one Marxism. Like, that's what I realized. The idea of an orthodox Marxism is a ludicrous idea. I mean, for one, because Marxism is supposed to be the historically development, and to change its development based on history. Lenin always argues that. That's why Lenin changes the dictatorship from, and it's Lenin, not Mao, that changes it from the dictatorship of the proletariat alone to the dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry, because of the fact he didn't think, and Lenin argues that you could not come up with a program that would be viable for Germany based off of, for Russia, based off of the political conditions of Germany, based off of the writings of Marx in exile. Like,
about England.
About England, right. And so it's not about England and France.
Yes.
It's not cohesive to You know, that was, interestingly enough, that's Lenin's argument. Now that becomes later on a way for people to redefine words so they don't mean anything. But in this time period, it's just saying, like, we can't know what the political things are going to be that we need to do in every case scenario, because Marx doesn't do that on purpose, right? And like, going back to that, like, throws all Marxists in a tizzy post Lukacs, because the idea that, like, no, we can't predeterminedly state out a political program now because we haven't done the prerequisite work to even do that is not something that a post-Lukacian Marxist is going to think. Like, I'm always like, I'm not I always talk about electoralism. I'm like, a lot of times you're putting the cart before the horse on these, like I agree with you about programmatic unity, but I don't agree with you that we could posit a program right now. You don't have enough of either socialist or of the working class in any political coalition in multiple countries, I may add, which is another part of this that people just ignore, to start to develop a multiple, a regionally specific differentiated program that also does not just try to impose something by ideological fiat on the working class or on any political subject, like, because we haven't done the work to build that. Which to me it's actually the part of me that throws me out of the discussion with all of the current trends of Marxists, because I'm like, Marxist Leninist I would argue are real. Like, I argue that they exist as a psychological development and people trying to differentiate themselves from democratic socialists who themselves are trying to differentiate themselves from anarchists. But that there's no actual political economy driving what they're doing, and that they don't really know enough of their own history, like the Marxist-Leninist history in a real sense, not to be sold a bunch of incoherent bullshit, which is why they're opened up to stuff like patriotic socialism or Duginism or Dungism is somehow coherent with all of I mean, I think Dungism is actually coherent with late 50s Stalinism, but it's incoherent with 30s Stalinism, like Stalinism, which is what the Stalinists will use to justify the legitimacy of Stalinism is early 30s Stalinism. But then they'll take ideas from like the economic problems of the Soviet Union and its continuity into Dungism, which also means that it's rejecting parts of Maoism while trying. It's crazy because they don't know their own history enough to know the fractures of which they are stepping.
Yeah, there was a Sino-Soviet split, guys.
Right. Like, why is there a Sino-Soviet split? Why can you not be both a classical, sturdy Stalinist, a 50s Stalinist, a Hojist, and a Maoist? You actually can't be all of those things at once. So what this is a differentiation from current, because, like with Trotskyism in the past, Trotskyism was always popular because it was removed from any actual existing political tradition that had power, right? Yes. And in Maoism in France was similar. It was removed from the Euro-communist parties, and you didn't know much about what was going on in China, so you could adopt a Maoist posture based off of some writings that were bleeding through, as it differentiates yourself from the formal institutional communist parties that were like in line with either the Mitterrand government or in a popular front with de Gaulle. And so it served that psychological function, but it actually was divorcing itself even from the real political development of Maoism concurrently, because it's still happening in China as they're picking up the stance in France. So it's not to say that nobody in France had any relationship to that. Some people clearly did, but that wasn't what was driving that as an ideological deviation. So my point is, these current like adjectival Marxisms are copes, basically. They don't have a living tradition, that are ways that people individually or in small groups respond to differentiate themselves from the trends of larger groups of socialists who are still not in a country of 340 million. 100,000 people in the DSA is nothing.
Yeah.
Like, even though it's an order of magnitude larger than any prior Marxist socialist organization since the Marxist takeover of the SDS.
Yes.
And
I mean, a lot of the justifications of these groups is kind of Lukacian by proxy, that they represent some kind of like tendency that's going to be actualized.
Right. They are the holders of a revolutionary tendency that is true. And you even see this in left communist arguments about like the Bordigist invariant program. I'm like, that doesn't even make sense under a Marxist standpoint. Like, how could you have an invariant, eternally true program unless you thought communism was a Platonic thing in which you arrived at, which is something Marx explicitly argues it is not. So it's
but what it is instead of that is hard to say.
Right.
It's I mean, there's like it's a mishmash. If there's like a bunch of observations about crisis tendencies, a bunch of predictions about growth and wage and profit rates, predictions about how the tendencies towards labor struggle, unemployment, all these things, and then there are a bunch of like political strategies, right? And they all don't necessarily point in one direction. Is the thing.
Yeah, they don't. And that's like part of my project, ironically for all my breach with the Platypus affiliated society, the one thing that I think I took from them that was useful is I don't think the left is going to be refounded on the current ideological understanding of itself as shown to itself by some group of intellectuals. I reject that. But I do think you have to show people all the fracture lines and left-wing thinking that people are trying to paper over. Because there's a reason why we can't have left-wing unity, and that's because we don't actually want the same things.
Yes.
But we have used words that obscure that fact. And that is a different project, and it's a different even systemic orientation than trying to defend a status quo on the right or marginally change it, because the actual consensus of what you want isn't required for that. What you're actually doing is defending elements of the status quo. It's easier to hide, and without the left being aware of those fracture lines, both in its theoretical and practical implications, and the fracture lines worldwide in self-understanding and in the way they understand their own history, there's no way to come up with any meaningful left politics that's working class or otherwise. Which is I think. What I think people are shocked by is I'm not a workerist. I'm not one of these people who thinks we can just copy what you think you're projecting upon workers as a whole, as a unified culture, and then posit that as an identity. That's not what I think anyone should be doing.
Yeah. And then here, Lukacs strikes again. What do you mean by worker?
Right, exactly. It's like, and Marx is not an answer for that, by the way. I mean, we've talked about this before. Yeah. Marx has a description of what makes one a proletarian, but like some key questions: is social necessity a requirement for being a proletarian or just some kind of worker? Is productivity and capital surplus required?
You got bullshit jobs, right?
Right.
Whatever the right account of those are. Yeah.
Right. Is productivity to capital surplus required? Because a lot of people in services or whatever aren't generative of the surplus. They live off it, so they're not productive workers according to Marx. Are they still proletarian or not? I mean, the funny thing is, like, you can get to the stuff of, like, I mentioned this on another podcast, but you get to like this mystical debate about whether or not the sandwich maker is a service sector worker or a productive worker. Like, because the sandwich is not a clear commodity, but it's a commodity that has no tradable value in and of itself because it's going to be consumed. But it does have futures trade values. So, and it's just like those kind of questions are like I think they're interesting as intellectual debates. They're politically useless. Unless you're going to try to argue that the base for Marxism is just the specifically productive blue-collar proletariat not in the service industry, in which case that's 10 to 13% of the population in any major nation on the planet right now. No society is it even 40% anymore.
Part of the issue is you want kind of like the workers who are productive to capital in the sense of being productive to surplus in the way you were talking about, the people who aren't leeching off things, to also be the people who if the rule of capital was deposed, would be capable of running things by themselves, or would be the people who would be able to take control of the productive machinery and run it more efficiently or better or what have you. And that doesn't follow at all, by the way. It's not clear that if a worker is productive or if an industry is productive, whatever, that like it could run on its own, or it could run if the social relations were completely different. This is something Lukacs wants to say, by the way. He wants to say that, like, the proletariat is not only like the most productive, it also would be able to run things without the rule of capital, right? Because society is rationalizing, society is centralizing, and that means that, when we're identifying some group as the working class, we're not only identifying the people who are most productive, where productive means produce surplus value, we're also identifying the people who, quote, really run society, in the sense of could run it even if, like, the rule of capital was deposed and you have different social relations. Yeah. And we don't know that either, by the way.
We don't know that. I mean, we have instantiations of it and stuff like the Cordones in Chile, who ran themselves even without the cybernetic theory, when the managers were deposed during, I think, the first coup. When I say they were deposed, the managers got tied up into other stuff. They weren't like overthrown, but the Cordones, the industries had to operate themselves because of a management strike, I believe. And they could. And a lot of people attribute that to cybernetics. Cybersyn wasn't up and operating by then. It was. But the question becomes, in a society with such complexity that we have now, and where knowledge is hyper specialized, even by broad specialists in management, is that still possible? And the answer is not clear. At all, actually. And no one's really tried to answer it either.
Yeah. Another way of saying this is that, all the lists of different things that worker has meant, that you were giving, productive, wage earner,
dependent on the wage fund versus not dependent on the wage fund.
Add to that possessing the knowledge of the revolutionary class. That's actually turns out to, we don't know what the connection of that is to all the other stuff we've named, right? Does someone being dependent on the wage fund mean that they possess administrative skill? That seems crazy.
right, exactly. Like, is administrative skill necessary? Yes, no. Can it be? Does it require bureaucratization, the creation of a new class? Yes, no. Like, these things have not been settled, and they're not settlable before you start to build something outside of capitalism. But we don't agree on what that something would even begin to be.
And what I think what I want to say even is that, like, all of those questions can't be settled by using the notion of a worker. That notion is just like too unclear to help us settle those debates.
Right. And which is why you see this degenerative tendency, I think, now is to, I'd always critiqued identity politics, but I actually have pointed out that a lot of workers' politics is a different identity politics. So the critique I apply to identity politics is also a critique I apply to workerism, because it puts certain kinds of wage earners above others. It has an implicit image of what this is and tries to meet that norm and promote it as a positive identity. And I think this is one thing the left communists in the 70s became repopularized in the aughts, actually in the aught teens too, actually really were wise on, is how do you sell promoting everything as a proletarian unique identity and class abolition at the same time?
Yes.
Like, those are incoherent concepts that most people do not want to deal with the fact that they're in fundamental tension with each other.
Yeah.
This is a Gilles Devey point that I even think the Endnotes Collective misses and doesn't really deal with.
I mean, if there is going to be a revolutionary class, it's not going to be it's going to have to be constructed in a way that's very hard to take for a lot of Marxists. all the things that a revolutionary class needs to be. It needs to be a social majority. It needs to have political power. It needs to have administrative knowledge. All those things are going to have to be made, made, not given.
Right.
And,
so
that's...
this becomes a constructive process, not a process of which we can just find the revolutionary clash and tack our mission onto it, which does change us from the classical Marxist assumptions.
And that's scary because, once you start introducing construction into the mix, Leclau is no longer this like scary person with whom we have nothing in common. It's now like we're in a space where post-Marxists are like debate partners, with
right.
all these positions from which
well, this is the whole thing that I've been arguing is a lot of people have been basically arguing that post-Marxism was like a bad faith or like a conspiracy to destroy Marxism. Like,
right.
No, it is a product of the failure of Marxist intellectuals in the 1960s.
Exactly.
Like, and then of actual attempts at Marxist governance in Europe under Euro-communist and social democratic conditions.
Right.
Like,
and I'm not saying that, I'm not saying we should become Euro-communist or anything like that.
No, me neither, because that didn't work for a reason. Just
of course not. Yeah, exactly. But the point is that classical Marxists comfort themselves from the fact that there is like some kind of intellectual Chinese wall between them and the sort of these other positions, right? Which I think I want to say we should want to say is an illusion that like you only achieve that kind of like radical qualitative difference from all of these other revisionist positions by ignoring the questions those movements were dealing with.
Yeah, I think that's the case, and I think that's where you and I have arrived, which has changed the mission of what we do.
Yeah,
because I'm no longer trying to resurrect a pure Marxism to which we could build a research and political program on. I'm now just saying Marxism, the assumptions that I learned from Marx are some of my baseline assumptions.
Same here.
But there's no way, like, I will not, if I created a Marxist research program and a Marxist political program, now it would be built off things far more advanced than was available to Marx, even if I based them off of basic Marxist assumptions.
Right.
So, like, systems theory as opposed to debates about dialectics, statistical math as opposed to trying to make algebra do whatever we want it to do. Our accounting math, which is what most of Marxism is based on. Actually, it's like basic accounting math, and it works on basic accounting math.
I mean, it also makes life harder because you can no longer, whenever people used to ask me in my more Marxist days that like, oh, what do you think of X person's position? I used to be able to say, oh, he's a liberal, or oh, he's a soc dem, or I can't say that stuff anymore. There has to be a more detailed answer in every case. But like, oh, why do you disagree with Bernstein? It's like, okay, well, I think he was wrong about this and this,
and right about this and this. And and I can't just say he was a crypto liberal or he was a bad Marxist.
Exactly. You can't say that anymore. You just can't say that anymore because it gives you a full sense of security that isn't there. There is no conceptual dividing line between me and the reformists. You have to just, I mean, sorry. You know what I mean when I say that.
Yeah, but I think you're right. I think like when I argue with reformists, my arguments now have to do with like the nature of the state, of this particular state. So we're dealing with the nature of things now, the implications of the 20th century as particularly developed in North America. That's actually different from the debates. Like as much as I, for example, will posit the United Front, both from above and below together. I also point out that like it's designed for a parliamentary system, a system that does not exist in the United States. Like,
exactly.
I guess there actually isn't a classical Marxist answer to how you would politically strategize in America because they didn't. Right. So like, and when they did when they really tried to do this by the end of third periodism, by 1936, the only thing they have on the table is the Popular Front, and even it doesn't really work in a non-parliamentary, even by its own standards, in a non-parliamentary context. So it means that the CPUSA basically looks like a radical collective group, a front for Moscow, the people funding all the black arts, and a lobbying group within the coalition of the Democratic Party, which it doesn't formally endorse, but all but endorses.
Right.
I
mean, the scary thing about all this, right, is that we can no longer say, with respect to every other political tendency, that we are doing capital S science and they are doing, ideology, right? Like that, we can no longer draw that distinction. We got to say what they're wrong about and what we're right about in specific.
Yeah, and I think that's where, like, I used to call people liberals as an insult, and I no longer do. And the reason why I no longer do is because liberalism applies to so many different things.
Exactly.
You no longer know what I'm insulting about someone by saying that, other than they're not a Marxist, maybe.
Right.
Like,
and now we don't even know what it means to be a Marxist. So what does it mean to
and people are like, oh, you're unnecessarily complicating things. I'm like, no, we're not. Actually, you and I began with this idea that this was a reifiable, clear thing that we could do. And the conclusion that I came to is, honestly, in most cases, that's a no true Scotsman argument.
Exactly.
And it's not fair and it's not true.
Like, you can take any bunch of claims and call them Marxism, right? Like, I have this all the time with like academic, historians or Brennerites. Like, oh, the Marxism isn't confused. Look, this is the thing I called Marxism in my book, but
it's also something different.
It's the thing that the thing that we're thinking is unclear is the thing that has all of these like political, economic, and social ambitions rolled into one, and if you don't buy into that, fine, but don't criticize us for complicating things just because you want to stick your head in the sand,
Yeah, I think that's where things really, where the rubber meets the road, is how complicated things get. Well, the thing is, basically, you have to answer these questions on an international basis, based on the way things are right now. And while a few Marxists think, I do think capital is useful. I do think some things of the Gotha program is useful. I think parts of the Grandes are useful. But none of them are going to get you everything you need.
Yes.
And there's no quote Marxist answer to everything you need. And anyone who sells you one is usually selling you someone else's answer that they're rebranding as Marxism for legitimacy points.
Yeah. And that's hard, right? This is not an easy thing to internalize, not for the both of us as much as for any of the listeners.
Right. No, because like one of the things that you and I used to try to do was the Marxist critique of Marxism. And then I gave that up because there was no consistent Marxism to which to apply to critique Marxism as a whole, other than some vague class notions that even that, like, well, if you say, well, Marxism isn't an ideology of the working class because it doesn't come from that, we never expected it to come from that, actually, neither does Marx. So that's not a critique that's consistent with Marx himself. That's kind of lazy, frankly. There's other things about that if you follow it through, you start realizing all these arguments that you heard in Marxism, even from people I like I mentioned Pannekoek. Anton Pannekoek, if you don't know, and his Lenin philosopher, one of his main arguments is basically a genetic fallacy. Like, Lenin's a bourgeois revolutionary because he uses bourgeois science and has a stance based off of basically pre-bourgeois science metaphysics, and that's bad. That's Pannekoek's argument. And I'm like, well, there might be practical reasons you might argue that some of what Lenin does is bad. There's plenty of practical reasons to argue that. But this sort of like, he's a bourgeois revolutionary, not because of his notions about state capitalism being necessary as a transition for him to socialism, not because of his developmentalism, but because of his stance on monism. Like, that's not useful for me. And so, like, Lukacs isn't the only place you encounter this problem, but it's such a problem that it becomes depressing when you realize, like, how many arguments about the scientificness of Marxism are basically post hoc rationalizations that have no bearing on even a fucking layman's conception of science, much less a sophisticated one.
Yeah.
And when people make fun of this on Twitter, yeah, they're just trying to avoid a problem, but they're actually, their impulse to make fun of it, other than the fact that it's avoidance and they don't want to deal with the implications, is actually accurate, because it's like, well, yeah, none of this is even, it doesn't even rise to the old insult in like skeptical circles. It's not even wrong.
Yeah.
Like you couldn't even disprove it. Like,
I mean, but again, it's important in the rejection of Marxism that we don't lose sight of the fact that, like, the reason Marxists pull all these questions together is that these questions do kind of have to be tackled together. They may not have to be tackled by one thing, but in the context of, being an ambitious political movement, you have to answer questions about how different classes from different nations hang together, what the relationship between the state and class struggle is, all this kind of stuff that, like, Lukacs blows up into a single question of revolution. Like, you do need to answer them. And one of the things that is good about Marxist circles is that, unlike liberals and often people on the right, like, we find that we can't ignore these questions. But and that's pat on the back for us. Unfortunately, we
don't have answers to them.
Yeah, exactly. we rather than ignoring them, we pretend we've answered them, which I don't know. I flip back and forth on whether that's worse sometimes.
It depends on. I actually think it depends on the question, but there are questions where I do objectively think it may be worse. It's like one of these stances where I'm like, some of you guys on international politics or ever have enough truth that you make idiotic assumptions, where you may have been better off being complete fucking morons. Like I mean, and that sounds. I mean, it's insulting on multiple levels, even to morons, but by that I mean, like, there are times where I'm like, you have to know something. It would have been better if you knew nothing at all. Like, you can do more damage with a little knowledge, but being used incorrectly or poorly, than you can with no knowledge, going in blind, but feeling your way through.
Hashtag the famine in Ukraine. 1930.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Was not a genocide, also wasn't good. And so, there's all kinds of issues, and we're not even tying into that the fact that people, on top of all these other rationalizations, try to rationalize their inclinations on geopolitics based off of nothing but geopolitical signifiers, without answering any of these questions, by pretending that the questions of geopolitics are a substitute for the questions, which are themselves a substitute for figuring out what Marxists meant by revolution and what revolutionary change would be.
I mean, the thing I want to end on, I agree with you. Is that in some ways the problem for us is that, like, the reflecting on this, like, the Marxist critique of Marxism is impossible because there's no Marxist critical standpoint from which to critique Marxism.
Right.
This is a real problem even for this conversation, which I'm glad we had. But like, these kinds of conversations always difficult making an impact, because in criticizing Marxism as a general abstract thing, we're kind of doing the exact thing that we're criticizing.
Right, exactly. The only difference is now we're aware that we've made the same mistake. I mean, that's like, because I would say what the realization of the end of Symptomatic Redness for me was that my attempt to turn back the clock and find a pure Marxism and all this, but in a modern context and to do so new, was actually the same recapitulations and problems that we saw in the beginning of the 20th century, and that no attempt to just hack that off, which a lot of people have tried to do, will fix the problem. Like, you have to deal with the actual historical failures of things that thought they were Marxist, and you can't just do this Scotsman game of, well, they weren't Marxist enough, so we don't have to deal with their implications of failure.
Right.
The Soviet Union was state capitalism, so it has no implications for Marxism. I'm like, actually, even if you think it's state capitalism, and I think in some periods it was, in some periods it was not that coherent, it doesn't actually answer the question, because there are plenty of fucking Marxists who thought that that was necessary.
Right.
And they didn't pull it from nothing. Like, you know, it's wildly how like Critique of the Gotha Program is both the dungest and the left communist favorite text.
Right.
Because depending on how you interpret a few key phrases in that, changes the entire spectrum of what you think it means. And one of the most basic assumptions is even someone like Jamie Peck, who, you know, I know I wouldn't say we're friends. We don't hang out, but
we've met once or twice.
Yeah. But with Jamie, like Jamie, for example, took a Leninist reading of the elements of bourgeois society, meaning markets. And I'm like, that's actually not what the text says. That's what people have assumed in that interpretive tradition, that like Marxist Leninist hermeneutic. But the text actually just says bourgeois elements, is actually vague on what they are.
Yeah.
Like,
which leaves the door open for the NEP.
Yeah, but it also leaves the door open for people who think that there is no transition, and that's all an imminent critique of stagism and Lassalleanism, which is what some ultra left comms would even say. So,
I mean, in some ways, Marxism good.
Yeah, and there's no left con consensus on that, by the way. So there's not even like a consensus interpretive tradition there.
Right. I mean, in some ways, Marxism is kind of like what people say about identity politics or wokeness or whatever. It's like this conceptual web where like whatever position you end up taking towards the whole the reified concept, you're already caught. You're doomed. Like you're caught in the web once you like whatever, you know, any position you take with respect to it will be ineffective and unsatisfying in one way or another. If you're anti it, if you're pro it, if you're trying to imminently critique it, like it drags you inside. This is why like any, you know, wokeness is the same thing. It's like you're pro woke, anti woke.
By engaging in the debate, you've actually granted a legitimacy to the framework, even when you're trying to question it.
Exactly.
Like,
it's just,
which is why liberals made better anti-communists than conservatives, because conservatives actually tried to debunk the ideology by going through it, whereas liberals just fucking ignored it.
Right.
Like
cultural Marxism, this whole cultural Marxism thing is just like, I just I talk to people on the right, and it's just like, why are you? It's so funny if you're actually on the communist left, hearing all these people talking about this like Gramsci-led movement that's active in American public schools.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a ridiculous conspiracy theory, and it's also interesting because it's like it's a way to like claim that liberals are secretly the Marxists while also exempting liberalism from any problems or debates. You could get back to, again, a true liberalism, you know, a classical liberalism, you might say, as opposed to the current degenerate liberalism or whatever.
Right.
It's the same game, actually.
But unlike for us, all that stuff is actually anchored in some kind of institutional power struggle.
Right. It's not totally an academic game or an interpretive game. And that's, I guess, where we can leave it for today. That explains how we sort of got where we are. Amogh, I will be back in touch, and you'll be back on the show. Hopefully, you'll be a semi-regular contributor here. I miss working with you. But, you know, I wanted people to understand there was a logic to why we felt like that initial project failed. It wasn't just because my divorce, although that was what finally prompted me not dragging it along anymore. And unlike that project, Varn blog doesn't really, its only goal is to put radical, quote, radical ideas, whatever that means.
Yeah.
And history, economics, political economies, all kinds of stuff out into the world. It does not have the same goal as Symptomatic Redness or as Mortal Science still currently does. Although I would also say Mortal Science, one of the issues we have is we don't agree on what science is, like, fundamentally. And so it's made it hard to like talk about like, well, how is Marxism going to be scientific or not when we don't share a definition of science? And that actually is an interesting problem, and probably where that show is going to end up going is probably into philosophy and applied science debates, which is, again, another show that like none of these things are really settled. They're active live questions, and that's how we kind of have to approach things. Thank you for coming on, and like I said, you'll be back on. Have a great day.
Sounds good.